notice that I'm in my mobile command post. We are up in Jacksonville at a Electrical Council of Florida um, meeting to induct the new annual president. Of my husband's a part of that organization, and we're just enjoying the wonderful people up here and the fabulous food. We went to an amazing restaurant last night. So anyway, if you guys would share out the space, I'd appreciate it. We're going to go ahead and get started. We are on chapter 10. And as I told you the other day, this one's about Cuba. And I was trying to kind of pare it down, but it does have some pieces to it that is very interesting in context to everything that we've been talking about. So we're just going to dive in. So the author starts at a New Year's Eve party that was, it says, it was hosted by Batista, who was the president of Cuba during the time when the mafia was running the island. He was more of a figurehead, and there's a whole history about how he came to power too. And if you guys, we did do a segment on Cuba. The history of Cuba is very, very interesting as to how it became the spot for the mafia, and going back to the early 1900s and the late 1800s, when basically we were engaged in the Spanish-American War, and there were fighters on Cuba that wanted their freedom from Spain, and then basically we captured it and didn't really ever give them their freedom. So if you guys don't know the history of Cuba, very, very interesting. And a lot of freedom fighters on Cuba only wanted to be the independent country that people had promised them that they would be, only to end up with people like Batista in charge, and the corruption of the American mafia dons going down there and opening casinos and enslaving the people, creating the elites, as they do in each one of these operations, to operate the transportation, the airline, the sugar plantations, blah, blah, blah. And that's where we first met William Polly, who is one of the dastardly faces that no one ever knows about behind Operation Gladio. So that's kind of the setting that we're in right now. One of the 60 guests at this party, all of which were the rich and powerful among the Cuban elite. Batista was hosting the party, and it says there was several of their military commanders present at the party too. The Batista government was already witnessing some signs that a revolution was going to occur. There was a irresistible force coming down from the mountains, which of course we know had CIA operatives in it training the Castro brothers in Che Guevara, because they too had become a little disappointed in Batista. At first, the guerrillas led by Fidel Castro had been contained in the mountain area by the Cuban army, but Batista's dictatorship was corrupt, oppressive, and had lost most of its support among the Cubans, to include the military. They had flocked to Castro's 26th of July movement, which was nicknamed M26, which took its name from the date of an unsuccessful revolt Castro had previously led. By 1958, the M26 guerrillas had come down from the mountains to create fronts in several parts of Cuba, defeating Batista's army in the battle. The handwriting was on the wall. Batista was no fool, and he knew what was coming. The dictator had only a brief appearance around midnight. He did not relinquish the reins of power at a meeting with his military commanders. Then, with his family and close supporters, Batista left for the airport. There, the group boarded 2 airplanes, which took off for Miami from Camp Columbia base at 2:40 in the morning on January 1st, 1959. The M26 unit closest to Havana at that moment was 150 miles away. The fighters at Santa Clara under the Argentinian commander Che Guevara. 7 hours after Batista's departure, Che was asleep atop the hood of his Jeep. He was awakened by the M26 officers and given the news. Guevara immediately organized his column to march towards Havana. The force left at dusk and drove on through the night. They arrived at the capital the next morning and went directly to the fortress, whose garrison of 15,000 men dwarfed in the small M26 column. The M26 commandante walked up to the iron drawbridge and shouted, "I'm Che Guevara. I want to talk to your chief." A few minutes later, a government jeep came out and crossed the bridge. The occupant was an army major, unholstered his pistol and handed it to Che Guevara. "We are not interested in fighting. It is not necessary now," because the dictator was gone. Throughout his time in power, the U.S. backed Batista. The change in government on the 2nd of July, 1959 brought a new beginning for the Cubans, but also a new opportunity for Washington in its relationship with Havana. The U.S. failed to grasp the opportunity was due both to the policies of Fidel Castro's revolutionaries once in power and to certain impatience on the part of Eisenhower's administration. These would lead to one of the most spectacular covert operation disasters after World War II. The origins of the hostilities that persist today between the U.S. and Cuba is shrouded in the mist of this time. It is therefore important to note that in 1959, Fidel Castro was not a communist, nor was his 26th of July movement a communist party. Far from it. Nor were the communists brought into the government at the time of the M26 took power. According to a 1958 CIA report, the Cuban Communist Party favored general strike tactics rather than armed insurgencies carried out by the M26. And let me take this opportunity because I know we've been inflexibly programmed to believe that everything that has been labeled a communist in our past is in fact a communist. It is not, nor has it ever been true that everything that the quote unquote national security apparatus labels a communist is in fact a communist. As a matter of fact, most of the things, if not all of the things that the same apparatus labels radical Islamic terrorism, isn't that at all either. And it's interesting to me how people can't take the next step. So if communists weren't all communist, then doesn't that follow that all Islamic terrorists aren't Islamic terrorists? It doesn't mean that they're not a terrorist. It simply means, in many cases, that the people that our national security apparatus tells us are communists aren't in fact communist at all. Well, then what's the problem? Well, let me point out, I'm going to reread what I just read. Most of what was labeled communist in Cuba was labor related. And why would labor related issues in Cuba be communist when we have, I don't know, 50 labor unions in the United States? They're not communist. Is anybody calling the AFL-CIO communist? They probably should, but they don't. So why are labor unions in the United States not communist if labor unions in Chile was communist, if labor unions in Italy was communist after they got out of World War II and Mussolini's, several decade-long dictatorship? Labor who had been used as slaves wanted rights in the workplace. That's applauded here, but everywhere else it's called being a communist. So we have to deprogram ourselves to stop having these visceral reactions to the use of the word communist and realize that most people, when they use that term, are lying to you. And if they're lying to you about who and what is a communist, then everything that's labeled anti-communist is suspect as well. Because how are you anti-communist when in fact the communist isn't actually a communist? you have been played to a 150% level. And this was all a propaganda campaign created by Bernays and all of the other Singleb and CIA operatives that worked to basically brainwash us into believing shit that's not true. So, the same is true, by the way, and very controversial to say about Che Guevara. Che Guevara was raised to be a doctor. He was never a revolutionary. He despised what had been done in Argentina. And he despised the fact that the US thought that they could go in every country in Latin America and do whatever the hell they wanted. And that they were enslaving the people of Latin America through the oligarch system and the purchase of their farmland. You know, all of the stuff that we're against. So we don't want foreign governments owning our farmland, but we went and owned everybody else's farmland. Not we as a country, our oligarchs. But our government protected the oligarchs owning of that farmland, and basically through corrupt land deals with United Fruit, American Fruit, and all those other companies. So Che Guevara, in the story of Operation Gladio and Operation Condor, specifically in Latin America, ironically shows up everywhere the United States is trying to overthrow a country under the guise of there's a communist under that rock. That should be your first clue to go back and relook at who that man was. Again, not clapping for him, not saying he was a good guy. What I do find ironic is he shows up to confront the CIA in every one of their coup efforts in Latin America. Oh, and in Angola too. All right, so Cuba's Communist Party numbered 12,000, and that's really defined as labor advocates. Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Mexico all had some form of this type of labor that was conveniently labeled as communist. Castro's own M26 was also many times larger than the Cuban Communist Party that they referred to as communist. So there wasn't ever a threat. Fidel Castro himself was not at first a communist, but rather a scion of the upper class because he was an attorney. His social standing, it is true, was blemished. He was born out of wedlock to his father's housekeeper. She eventually bore Angel Castro 5 children before his first wife left him, and he married the former servant. Angel Castro had a 23,000-acre farm. Very wealthy. His estate later was estimated in the early 1960s at $500,000. Fidel was the fourth of 7 children, 2 by the first wife, and he was born in 1926. He studied at Jesuit schools and later went to a law university in Havana, where he began politics as a student leader. Fidel acquired his progressive politics in Colombia and Mexico, and he was able to temper them in jail for almost 2 years after the failure of his first revolution. Castro was freed from prison on the Isle of Pines in May 1955 in an amnesty granted by Batista, but within a year had formed his guerrilla units. Once in power, Castro was opposed to Marxism and soon styled himself as a maximum leader. Castro may have begun a new dictatorship, but in this respect, he was no different from Batista and no less worthy of American support, because that's what we were in the business of, not democracy. In its relations with the Castro government, the Eisenhower administration began a wait-and-see attitude, with which soon underwent subtle changes. Because keep in mind, this is the U.S. mafia, both Jewish and Italian playground. This is where they went. They had an agreement that in Cuba, and they did the same thing in Little Rock, or the Hot Springs, in Arkansas. If you went there, you were not allowed to do any mafia hits or anything else. That was kind of like where they all shared some commonality. So they basically all vacationed together in Cuba and Hot Springs, Arkansas. That has a whole history of itself, where they had basically pinky sweared, no, none of that business happens here, because they were collectively using Colombia as the drop off point for all opium, heroin products coming into the United States. So it was good business for everybody. At the CIA, the initial assessment of the Cuban situation explained Batista's fall in terms of the corruption of his regime and the consequent lack of public support for it. Alan Dulles is said to have taken this report and personally rewritten it. A paper that Dulles did forward to the Secretary of State in February 1959 was not all complimentary of the Castro government. Calling the situation far from stable, the paper asserted that the M26 organization was lacking dynamic positive leadership, its government floundering. It had just started. He's making this shit up. Saying that they were inexperienced because they just took over. Thus, the glamour of the mountain gorillas and the straggly beards was rapidly wearing off as its realities of the situation became apparent. Those were his words. Fidel visited Washington in April to give a speech at the Society of Newspaper Editors. He did not meet Eisenhower, but he spoke with State Department officials and had a 3-hour discussion with Nixon, which you know is bad news because that's the exact same way they treated Lumumba. The vice president thought Fidel was sincere enough, quote, he is either incredibly naive about communism or under communist discipline, unquote. So there you go. The narrative has already started. He had nothing to do with communism. The State Department wrote an analysis, and this is it, quote, with regard to his position on communism and the Cold War struggle, Castro cautiously indicated that Cuba would remain in the Western camp. However, his position here must still be regarded as uncertain, even though he told you what he was going to do. He did not go sufficiently far enough in his declarations to be vulnerable to the criticism of radicals among his supporters, unquote. So you can already see the narrative being seeded that he's going to be a communist because we want our island back. And that's the only way they can get their island back because of the NSC memo 5412-2. He has to be labeled a communist in order for them to take him out. Castro did have a problem, but it was with the conservatives, not the radicals in Cuba. By and large, the landed and moneyed families in Cuba had maintained their ties with the Batista forces. Fearful of them, they were soon leaving in large numbers, taking their dollars with them. By December 1959, there were 100,000 Cuban immigrants in the United States alone. And that's where the CIA gets the idea of using them against Castro. Without these skilled workers, technicians, doctors, lawyers, and their money, there was little private or public capital to diversify Cuba's economy away from sugar production, the market for which was concentrated in the United States because they're trying to kill all of us, and strictly regulated by an American government quota system. At the same time, the mafia, which had had large gambling concessions in Havana hotels under Batista, left Cuba after the prohibition of that activity. The solution was expropriation, as had been tried by Mossadegh in Iran and Arbenz in Guatemala, which spelt their doom. This was an element of irony in this, since Castro's father had once worked for United Fruit. That's irony of all ironies. In any case, a decree allowing nationalization was sent forward in the fall of 1959. In December, the first American concern, a local subsidiary of Otis Elevators, because keep in mind, they've got a lot of casino, hotels, multi story buildings down there, was intervened as the Cubans called expropriation. So basically, they took it back. During 1960, the sugar plantations and the Havana hotels followed. The Cubans added to the injury by not offering compensation to any of the company owners. A second fear was that the Cubans would attempt to export their revolution throughout Latin America. There was reports of a legion created for this purpose. Now, the reports are bullshit, but I want to make a point here. What they were fearful of is not that Cubans would export communism to Latin America. They were fearful that the people that were already being thwarted in their revolutions would gain inspiration by Castro's success and him not succumbing to the great power to the north, the United States. So if they don't get Castro under their thumb and under their thumb quickly, the rest of the people that they've subjugated in the rest of Latin America might get a big idea that they can do this too. And that absolutely cannot happen. That's what their real fear was. Okay. And they list the names of possible follow-on revolutions of the overthrowing of dictatorships that had been installed by the CIA, naming Panama, which we've read all about, Guatemala, the Dominican Republic, all having CIA installed dictators at that minute. So if this model stands, the CIA's panicking. All right. These rebels were nationals of their own countries, and while some did receive Cuban assistance, the movements were in no sense anything to do with Castro other than him as a role model. In fact, the invasion of the Dominican Republic was carried out from Puerto Rico, a territory of the United States. In any case, the evidence indicates that this taking back of countries' assets from the United States oligarchs was far more important than support of any revolutions, because they are the ones that the CIA really works for. There was at least some recognition of these factors in the United States government, even at the CIA. In a November 5th, 1959, the deputy director, General Charles Cabell, testified in a Senate Judiciary Subcommittee that neither the Cuban Communist Party nor the CIA considered Castro a communist. The Cuban Communist Party did not control Castro's government, but that it was seeking to influence him. Cabell also downplayed Cuban participation in Latin America revolutionary expeditions, excuse me, pointing out that there had been no organized involvement of Cubans in any other location in Latin America. Significantly, Cabell conceded that the anti-communists have an interest in rumors, this is a quote, anti-communists have an interest in rumors which will increase our alarm over communist influence in Cuba. Let me read that again. Anti-communists have an interest in rumors which will increase our alarm over the communist influence in Cuba. Now, who are these anti-communists? This is the World Anti-Communist League. This is Chiang Kai-shek. This is all of the people in the CIA having set up all of their anti-communist movements, which are basically fascist, that want control of the drug market. And they want their island back. As Cabell spoke on Capitol Hill at Foggy Bottom, Secretary of State Harter, Herter, was putting the finishing touches on a memorandum he sent to Eisenhower the very same day, November 5th. The paper contained 4 recommendations far more forceful actions on Cuba. They included doing nothing to assist Castro's consolidation of power, a propaganda campaign in Latin America to promote the U.S. conception of democracy, which is a dictatorship, encouragement both within Cuba and elsewhere of opposition to any course of action the Castro government takes, while avoiding the impression that the U.S. is influencing them. That's an interesting teeter-totter. And preserving mutual Cuban American interests for the United States in a quote-unquote reformed Cuban government, which means they're going to form a government in exile just like they did with China. Same pattern over and over and over again. The Secretary of State ended on a note that's very revealing. This is a quote. In view of the special sensitivities of Latin America to the U.S. intervention, I would propose that the existence and substance of this current policy statement be held on a very strict need-to-know basis, unquote. You know, secrecy for national security. Dwight Eisenhower accepted both the policy proposals and the recommendation for secrecy. On November 9th, Andrew Goodpaster informed Harder of the approval. The White House knowledge of the action was to be restricted to Goodpaster himself, Ike's son, John S.D. Eisenhower, and one confidential secretary. In April 1959, the president had been willing to wait a year to see how Castro dealt with Cuba's problems. Now, long before that time was up, Eisenhower had already approved a policy that was in direct opposition to Castro, while he's still not a communist. From these offices around the reflecting pool, CIA officials quickly fell into line behind the new policy. The DCI asserted in a public speech December 4th that Latin America communists had instructions to use nationalism as a slogan to justify breaking ties of friendship with the U.S. Now, I've highlighted this. I've got to read this again, because this is so important to what's happening right now in the United States. The chief of the CIA said Latin American communists had instructions, as if it's coming from the Soviet Union, to pretend you're a nationalist. And that would be used as the justification to not be a friend of the United States. So, anybody who claims to be a nationalist is actually a communist wearing a cloak. And that's just so apropos to what's going on right now, right? So Trump, by definition, is a nationalist. That's what America First means. But they collectively already decided that he's a fascist. So any use of the term, and that's the reason why you have the far right, that label, which is why I refuse to use it. They have learned that you put something on each end of that, so anybody that's in that segment, either the right or the left, if they get out of line from the middle, but on the right side, you are immediately ostracized to the far right, which they've already labeled fascism, and the same thing on the left. If you're on the left and you get out of line, you are scooted right down the continuum to the far left, and you're a communist. This is a brainwashing propaganda campaign that every single person in America has to unlearn, because there is no such thing as left and right. That's bullshit. But it's bullshit that was done to do exactly what I just described. And you're seeing it in official writings. This is exactly what they're saying. If you proclaim to be a nationalist, we're going to call you a communist. Because we can't have nationalism, because that kicks the oligarchs out of the country that we want to dominate, and that we're going to steal all your resources and enslave your people. And that's exactly what they've done to us by pushing people out to those labeled positions. We just merrily march right along in the third way, the middle, and pretend like that shit's not happening. Meanwhile, they've enslaved us here, just like they're doing in Cuba back in the early 60s. 1 week later, Allen Dulles received a memorandum from the chief of the DDP Western Hemisphere Division, Joseph Caldwell King, which insisted Castro's, wait for it, far left dictatorship could not be permitted to stand because it could encourage expropriations of American property in other Latin countries. They cannot allow Cuba to be a nationalist, independent democracy. They can't do it. King advocated for actions, among them, thorough consideration be given to the elimination of Castro. But what do you have to do first? According to 5412-2, he has to be labeled a communist or they can't kill him. Allen Dulles carried the idea of an anti-Castro project to the 5412 group on January 13th, 1960. Just a year into him being in the position, with no signs that he's actually a communist. There, the state representative questioned any effort to move against Castro in the absence of a solid Cuban opposition, like a government exiled. Dulles acknowledged his criticism, but emphasized CIA actions would be aimed at allowing opposition leaders to gain a foothold, rather than any quick move against Castro. Let it run over a length of time, Dulles said. The U.S. will not be able to tolerate the Castro regime in Cuba because we don't want that model succeeding. The 5412 group gave its conditional approval to the project. On January 18th, a dozen officers met with J.C. King to organize a Cuban task force. The task force became the fourth branch of King's division. It was labeled WH4 in CIA usage. Selected for chief of this task force was a man whose pseudonym called by existing accounts either Cliff or Jake Engler, Engler, another Burma OSS veteran. Engler was a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania. He remained in intelligence as a veteran of Operation Success and had commanded the CIA facility at Fort Benning, Georgia. At the time he was picked for WH4, Engler was serving as the chief of station in Caracas. Early planning for the Cuban project focused upon several components. One was the initiative to train 20 to 30 Cubans who would return to the island to become local guerrilla leaders, much as the CIA had previously done in Tibet. A second element was a plan to disrupt the Cuban economy through sabotage of such major targets like sugar refineries. A third possibility was direct action to eliminate Fidel. On March 9th, the WH4 task force learned that the director of Central Intelligence had prepared a special policy paper to be presented at the next meeting of the 5412 group. The plan envisioned a Cuban exile force to be trained over a period of 6 to 7 months. Allen Dulles feared that the interim there might be a Cuban attack against the American leased base at Guantanamo Bay, while J.C. King pointed out that unless the top Cuban leaders could be eliminated in one package, the operation might be a drawn-out affair. A White House meeting the next day touched upon these themes, and the Cuban item was ninth on a long list of the agenda. In the discussions, the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Arleigh Burke, opined that what was needed was a Cuban leader to unite the anti-Castro factions. Many of the Cubans around Castro were worse than Castro himself. Burke felt, and therefore any plan for removal of the Castro leaders had to be a package deal where you had somebody to insert behind them. Allen Dulles observed that there were anti-Castro leaders, but most of them were in Miami. The DCI remarked came in reply to Eisenhower wondering what could be done. Eisenhower is quoted as saying, "We might have another black hole of Calcutta in Cuba." In fact, the main action on the Cuban plan occurred outside of NSC deliberation. In accord with Eisenhower's December 1958 instruction, Gordon Gray said that he did not wish the specifics of covert actions presented at the council. Indeed, Allen Dulles had already met with Eisenhower and Gray on the Cuba matter. Accompanied by aides, Dulles went armed with schematics, color drawings, sugar refineries, like a whole map of Cuba. And basically, it amounted to a harassment campaign. Eisenhower listened and said, "Allen, this is fine. But if you're going to make any move against Castro, don't just fool around with sugar refineries. Let's get a program that will really do something about Castro." Of course, Allen Dulles loved that, responded, "Yes, sir," and we were off to the races. Dulles was back within weeks with a new plan, a scheme he unveiled on March 14th, 1960, at the annual review of the 5412 group. 3 days later, at 2:30 p.m. on a Thursday, the 17th, the president took the unusual step of himself convening the meeting in the Oval Office. The subject of the Cuban plan was presented to Eisenhower, and he accepted it. The CIA plan was embodied in a memo titled "A Program of Covert Action Against the Castro Regime." So we're already up to calling it a regime. He's not a president. And don't get sidetracked on the fact, well, he's a dictator. Well, so was Batista, and we loved him. We have a very sliding scale of ethics where it relates to what a quote unquote democracy is. The CIA plan, let's see. The essence of the program would be to induce, support, and as far as possible, direct action both inside and outside of Cuba to the eventual demise of Castro. The plan envisioned that since a crisis inevitably entailing drastic action in and towards Cuba could be provoked by circumstances beyond the control of the U.S. before the covert action program was ready to accomplish its objectives, every effort would be made to carry it out with such a progressively quick time frame that there would not be a chance for an alternative crisis to usurp their made-up crisis. Allen Dulles' subordinates at the CIA division felt they were able to create a reasonable, appealing, and unified Cuban opposition located outside of Cuba, after which a powerful propaganda offense could be created in order to establish it inside. That's where they came up with the use of the Gray radio station. And this author even knows about it. He talks about the one on Swan Island that I did a whole thread on, how it was set up. It's just an amazing story. If you guys don't know the story of Swan Island, just search my profile for Swan Island. It'll knock your socks off. The CIA reported that work was already in progress towards the creation of a covert intelligence action organization inside of Cuba. It would be responsive to any orders from the exiled community, which they were going to create. Although the paramilitary staff presented the concept in fairly great detail, most of which remained classified, the CIA budget estimates did not provide for the size of force eventually attained. The concept received the code name Pluto. The paragraph on military actions from Pluto concept memorandum is worth quoting in full, and I'm going to do so. Quote, "Preparations have already been made for the development of an adequate paramilitary force outside of Cuba, together with mechanisms for the necessary logistical support of covert military operations on the island. Initially, a cadre of leaders will be recruited after careful screening and trained as paramilitary instructors. In a second phase, a number of paramilitary cadres will be trained at secure locations outside of the U.S. so as to be available for immediate deployment into Cuba to organize, train, and lead resistant forces recruited there after the establishment of one or more centers of resistance, unquote. Preparations were expected to take 6 to 8 months, although the CIA reported that a limited air capability already existed under CIA control in one of their fake airlines and could easily be used. Within 2 months, the agency planned to supplement this with additional cover. Having approved the initial concept, the president settled back and waited for results. The CIA went ahead with propaganda plans as well as operations on the island, but no armed insurgency um, against Castro ever materialized as a result of these efforts. The CIA responded by increasing the size of Operation Pluto, a lot because bigger is always better, along with the numbers of cadre. By August, the CIA had refined their plans and presented it to the president. On August 18th, there was another White House meeting with Dulles in the 5412 group, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Treasury Secretary Robert Anderson, who headed an administration committee to coordinate trade policy on Cuba. This time, the president approved measures that implemented the planning ordered back in March. Among those measures was a budget for Operation Pluto, which was an estimated $13 million. It could go as high as 15. $15 million to overthrow the Cuban government, who is not a communist. One day that summer, Allen Dulles visited Maurice Stans, Stans, director of Eisenhower's Bureau of Budget, to ask that the money be included in the CIA request for fiscal year 1962. $15 billion is a lot of money today. In 1962, it was a shit ton of money. It is needed, explained Dulles, to supply and train somewhere in Central America a group of Cuban exiles who will be preparing for a guerrilla invasion to overthrow Castro. Stans questioned the expenditure, but the DCI refused to provide any documentation to support it. When Stans protested, Allen Dulles said, "It's none of your damn business. If you question my authority, go to the president and ask him." Stan did exactly that. But Dwight Eisenhower smoothed his budget director's feathers, and he said, quote, "I authorized Dulles to spend that money, but I did not authorize any specific military action by the anti-Castro Cubans. That will have to come later, and I won't give it an okay unless I'm convinced it is essential and I'm convinced it won't fail," unquote. Stan went back to his office and wrote Operation Pluto money into the budget. Eisenhower probably ruled the day in later years, but the cabinet meeting on August 18th, 1960, the president, and keep in mind, 1960 is an election year. The president confirmed his approval of Pluto funding and instructed the Pentagon to cooperate with the CIA in training the Cubans. Though he prohibited any use of American military in combat, they were going to be intimately involved in the logistical support and training of the operation. Approval at the White House brought almost immediate action at the CIA headquarters. In the offices of WH4, the task force listened while Allen Dulles laid down the parameters for Pluto. And Dick Bissell supplied the details. Tracy Barnes, the chief of the DDP, which basically was the psychological and paramilitary staff, would be Bissell's man supervising this task force. He, too, did a lot of talking. Richard Helms sat quietly, which was very out of character for him. Soon, Helms stopped coming to the Pluto meetings altogether. The silence from the DDP's chief of operations was attributed to his distaste and opposition of the plan. Helms increasingly focused on running the CIA clandestine intelligence missions, leaving Cuba entirely up to Bissell. But unlike Helms, Bissell had complete faith in Operation Pluto. So did Barnes and the WH4 task force, which as of yet only comprised 10 officers. Jake Endler ran the unit and made day-to-day decisions. David Atlee Phillips, who comes up a lot, a veteran of Operation Success, plus 3 years of service under journalistic cover in Batista, Cuba, which means, what? The CIA pretending to be a journalist who's actually a spy in a foreign government or a foreign country? Yeah, they do it all the time. Just ask Khashoggi. Oh, you can't because he's dead, because they figured him out. Um, Phillips headed the psychological warfare area. Two chiefs of political actions were E. Howard Hunt, who had done the same thing during Guatemala, and Jerry, Gerry, Droller, Droller, who basically had been working in the European area, didn't speak Spanish, and had no Latin American experience at all. The first component of Pluto was to get underway in a psychological warfare aspect. Phillips met with Bissell about setting up black radio stations to beam into Cuba. The psychological action chief wanted 6 months of propaganda to prepare the ground in Cuba for paramilitary operations. Bissell gave him a month to get the broadcast going. Luckily, the PSYOPs people found in West Germany a surplus of U.S. Army transmitters, which was about to be given to the Voice of America. The agency managed to take over the medium wave radio transmitter, 3 railroad cars worth of equipment. It was shipped to Swan Island in the Caribbean, where the Navy built a pier just to land the thing. Initial broadcasts were made on May 17th, exactly 30 days after the orders were given. Political action was more problematic. Operation Pluto was predicated on the active opposition to Castro. As will be seen, opposition within the island was mostly eradicated during the same months the CIA was creating Operation Pluto. Among the exiles, meanwhile, it was possible to choose only between those who had ties to Batista or those who had opposed him by aligning themselves with the 26th July movement. President Eisenhower understood when he approved Pluto that Batista's supporters were not to be used in the operation. Certain senior CIA officials also believed in this concept of a third force, which in the Cuban context meant moderate M26 adherents who had split with Castro. It so happened, however, that WH4's political action chief held different views. E. Howard Hunt was known within the agency for his extreme conservatism. For Operation Pluto, that meant that Hunt was largely unwilling to cooperate with any of the moderate former M26 elements. Jerry Droller, on the other hand, was an opportunist who did not care much about political affiliations. There would be continual friction on the subject of which Cubans to use. The search for a surrogate political structure as the government in exile centered in Miami, where everybody had came. The CIA established a task force and a command post. The cover was an electronics firm that worked on government contracts in order to explain the building's tight security and extensive communication equipment. Hunt became the Miami action officer while Droller worked out of Washington, posing as a still tycoon on his visits to the forward base. By the end of May, the CIA had forged significant political links to back the formation of a Cuban Democratic Revolutionary Front called FRD. Now, a couple of points here. So you have somebody posing as a reporter. You have somebody posing as a steel company, which means they had to actually affiliate with the steel company. That's not something that you can fake. So these are the way you know that the interoperability of the oligarchs' companies and the embedding of spies into them, this is something that obviously is a reoccurring theme that we've discovered in Operation Gladio. The fluidness of them going into other government operations, both the military, State Department, FBI, DEA, IRS, and the fluidness of them going into all of these oligarch corporations too, all around the world. They just step in and they're there pretending to be a businessman when in fact they're still a CIA operative. And that's why today, when I was doing those exposés on that Deloitte place and the Battelle place, the fact that we know that there are CIA people in these companies needs to bother everybody. All right. Later critics of the Cuban fiasco point out that this selection excluded fully 116 other Cuban political factions. So they're going to just pick one, and it's going to be the one that's the most radical, not the one that had the most likely chance of succeeding. And this is exactly what happened in Angola. When they went there, there's like 3 or 4 major parties. They picked the one that was the most corrupt. And the people fought back and won. And our CIA lost. By this time, paramilitary preparations had also begun. Training for radio operators that would land in Cuba and work with the insurgents was started. And this blew my mind. They did it, and I made a post about this when I first discovered this. The communications element of this, what the training for it was conducted on Usepa Island, which is just off the coast of like Fort Myers in Florida. I have a very good friend of mine that owns a house on Usepa. My daughters and I, when I was stationed at MacDill, used to go down there all the time. It's dumbfounding to me to have walked around that island because you can only get there by boat, which would be perfect for a CIA training place. To know that I'm walking around what was a CIA training camp on Usepa. That just blows my mind. Then they went on to Panama for 8 weeks at a secluded compound at Fort Gulick. The group included Jose Perez San Roman, Manuel Ardtime, and Jose Blanco, who we've come up on. These are trained assassins. These are like Felix Rodriguez type guys. Already, it was becoming apparent that the original guerrilla concept was not going to work. The CIA decided to expand the exile force to 700 men, but it required a much longer training schedule. A logistical choice for a location was Guatemala, where the agency had turned out a government so easily in 1954. And by turnout, he means overthrow. Robert K. Davis, now the station chief in Guatemala City, was told to find someplace suitable. Davis had good contacts with local business community. And if you guys remember, we end up with Roberto Alejandros, who is the brother of the Guatemalan ambassador in Washington, D.C., all corrupt, volunteered his coffee plantation that was up in the Sierra Madre Mountains and isolated, so that Aleros thought that all they would have to do is was fly in a few refrigerators, and because it was already a functioning plantation, they had the ability to absorb, this huge amount of people. The changes of plans confused some officials in the CIA back in DC. Not the least of them was the president. On June 28th, President Eisenhower told Gordon Gray he did not quite remember the details of all of this stuff happening. Gray reminded the president of a program that Allen Dulles had presented and then reported the current thinking as a timeline. Several weeks later, Eisenhower was in Newport, Rhode Island. Gray further informed him of a new CIA proposal to expand the training of the exiles and increase the budget. Before the end of August, the Guatemalan facility was ready, and on the 22nd, the cadre trainees were flown into Fort Gulick. The radio operators had already been in place for over a month. Recruits for the Rebel Air Force arrived August 29th, and the first Cuban doctor for the exiles about a week later. This new camp was going to be called Camp Trax, Trax. Training could not begin immediately. agreed for the CIA to use his coffee plantation when the agency determined to expand the exile force. Thus, the first arrivals spent much of their time constructing barracks for the increased amount of people. The first night a large number of Cubans were at tracks was August 27th. Soon afterwards, there were 160 recruits. In late September, weapons began arriving. Training was provided with 20 CIA contract personnel, including, this is very important, Eastern Europeans. And who are the Eastern Europeans? Oh, you know, the Eustachi guys and all of the Gladio operators that we created the stay behind units from. Not in Eastern European as what you would be thinking today, but like people with that had already from the immigrant population, because they're not dragging people out of Ukraine to do this, but there are Ukrainians in this. Those kind of Eastern Europeans among the immigrant population that is now being used and trained in Operation Gladio in Europe. Mexicans, because remember the World Anti-Communist League and the whole group of Mexicans that are involved in that out of Guadalajara, the college there. Oh, and isn't it convenient this author uses the word Chinese, because it wasn't Chinese at all. It was Taiwan. There's Taiwanese instructors at the Cuban exile camp. I'm just going to call it a Gladio camp because that's what it is, to overthrow the government of Castro. Taiwanese paramilitary people. They even had a few Filipinos, you know, from Singleb's entourage there. Quite the joint operations, isn't it? With the growing number of exiles and trainers involved in Operation Pluto, the CIA cover story began to break down. The early recruits had dealt with Americans who insisted that they were working privately and had no government connections. The scale of tracks and the activities there gave away that there's no fucking way they're doing this without the approval of the US government, because it's freaking huge. So the Cubans knew better, and a New York Times reporter, Tad Szule, in Costa Rica, began covering a conference of foreign ministers of the Organization of American States, OAS. He learned of Operation Pluto from this group of people. So he began checking with the State Department and started writing stories and asking questions. Another potential leak was plugged in Florida. Local residents near Homestead had seen Cubans drilling and heard large loudspeakers at a farm. As a joke, some firecrackers were thrown into the compound. The exiles thought they were under attack and poured from their quarters with guns firing everywhere. The prankster was wounded, several Cubans arrested, and only a confidential request from the federal government did the charges get dropped. Wow. So we have a terrorist training camp in Miami shooting people who lit firecrackers. In Washington, Alan Dulles received the reporter and his bureau chief and was able to convince them not to write the story in the local Miami newspaper, because they had embedded in the local Miami newspaper, which this guy may or may not know and just don't want to include it, CIA operatives at the Miami newspaper. The air power was a crucial element of the Pluto program. Transport between Florida and Guatemala was vital, but secrecy could not be maintained if the U.S. military aircraft would have been used, which they weren't allowed to use anyway. So on July 15th, Alan Dulles approved the proposal to create a new fake airline. In early August, the agency acquired cheaply for exactly $307,506.10, all outstanding shares of Southern Air Transport, which was basically just like the CAT and Air America. The cargo airline had a 4-acre property, owned exactly one C-46, and leased another. Planes and crews from Air America quickly beefed up the Miami line, which carried recruits from a former Navy base at Opalaca to Guatemala. There were also, as we have read in another book, they hired for this airline Alabama guardsmen, some of which died for the training operation because they had flown the C-46 before. The Florida run was used strictly for the purposes of logistics. Operation Pluto had to be an actual rebel air force to fly supply missions to Cuba. This aspect of the program was held very closely by Dick Bissell, who set up an air staff of 14 officers. It was supervised by Air Force Colonel Stanley Beerly, Beerli, who had previously ran the U-2 program for the CIA. So see, I'm calling bullshit. A guy that's in the United States Air Force in a uniform that works exclusively for the CIA is not an Air Force officer. I'm sorry. They're just not. Bissell told Davis to have his airstrip functional within a month. The air station, or the station chief, did his best, contracting an American construction firm already active in Guatemala. But construction was slow because it was rainy season. Their work was heavily over budget, costing, at the end of the day, $1.8 million. The airstrip was about 30 miles from Camp Trax, where the CIA had assembled an air force of B-26 bombers and 5 C-46 transports. They then needed facilities to house the crewmen and maintenance people for these aircraft. And the CIA air staff soon decided that there was not enough air crew to meet the needs. And that's where the Alabama Guard people come in. Major General George Doster recruited from among his Air Guard pilots volunteers, not to go down there in a guard status, but as CIA contractors. As the component of the Cuban plan that evolved a possible assassination of Castro, the CIA eventually made certain inquiries in its technical services division of some of the preparations, but not much came of them. So there were contacts between the mafia to get better ideas of how to execute missions in Cuba, since they knew the lay of the land. For Operation Pluto to work, the exiles also needed a navy. So there were going to be airdrops made. They were going to need ships. There was a requirement to infiltrate guerrilla cadres before landing, acquiring another basically front company in the Florida Keys, which was called Mineral Carriers. The CIA got large vessels from another base. The ships were converted into landing craft. And 2 CIA contract officers controlled all of this. One was named Grayston Lynch, who was SF Army and had worked for the CIA in Laos. Another was Rip Robertson, the CIA man who had cashiered, who had been basically fired for allowing the bombing of the British freighter during Operation Success, where they tried to take out the British ship. But he got hired back. President Eisenhower alleged motive for approving Operation Pluto was to counter a leftist or communist Castro, but he wasn't communist. Despite that reasoning at the time of the go-ahead, Cuba did not have even a diplomat relationship with the Soviet Union. They'd never even talked to him. Castro, during this, so Castro's basically getting intel. There are embeds in the Cuban exile community in Miami who are funneling back information to Castro. Castro knows all of this. And Castro, for the first time, as he's watching Operation Pluto escalate, and now knows there's an air component to it, for the first time, he receives a visit from the Soviet foreign minister, Anastas Mikoyan. And he, the foreign minister, agrees to give Castro $100 million loan in order to help him update his arms and military capability, because now at this point that they're plotting to overthrow Castro, the US has officially cut off all loans and put a bad word in at the IMF and everywhere else. So Castro, not a communist at this point, can't get any money from anybody. So they want him as a sitting duck for them to come attack. They don't care if the people don't have money, aren't able to pay for imported goods that they need to survive. They've cut them off. So several strange incidents happen around this time. A plane piloted by an American blew up while flying over a refinery in Cuba. A month later, near that same town, a second plane was shot down and 2 Americans were captured. The captives, William Sloskels and Howard Runquist, were injured and hospitalized. One of them issued a statement that the Cuban government itself had hired them for the flight. The story could have been true, or as likely a bit of propaganda for different disinformation for the American press. What they're actually doing at this point is they're flying missions over Cuba, napalming the sugar plantations. They're burning the food that Cuba needs to eat, while at the same time cutting off all ability for Cuba to get imports at the same time. That's what these airplanes are doing. So, while the politicians argued about how much to spend on all of this, all of the, T crossing, whatever, the little resistance inside of Cuba had gone away. The failure to cooperate with any of the people that were legitimate opponents inside of Cuba had basically doomed, well in advance of anything that John F. Kennedy got blamed for. They're shooting themselves in the foot time after time after time because they allowed themselves to be infiltrated. So Castro knows everything that's going on. They did overflight of Cuba to burn all of the crops, ending up in an aircraft being shot down with Americans flying it, which would be today the equivalent of shooting down an aircraft in Russian airspace with Americans and not Ukrainians in it. I mean, that's how outlandish this is. So they go on with all of the planning as if none of this shit even happened, pushing Castro further and further into the arms of the Soviet Union. And like with Allende and Mosaddegh and Lumumba, push, push, push. Mount the stress and the military and the attempts of overthrow and the overtaking the media and all of this stuff, further pushing them until they get to a point where they're going to make some misstep, whether it's calling in for, like the loan or ship of supplies, anything, even humanitarian in nature. That one critical phone call is going to get intercepted and used as propaganda to say, see, we told you he was communist all along. So at the end of this, well, we're not anywhere near the end of this, but it was determined at one of Eisenhower's, because again, all of this stuff is coming out. There's newspapers. It says on October 30th, the Guatemala City Daily report, ran an article about Camp Trax. He's telling them everybody's here, that the Cubans are down here training for war. Another regional studies newsletter published by Stanford University, because there's always a Stanford angle, basically turned into an editorial in The Nation talking about what's going on down there, that they're planning for a war, and they're using Cuban exiles for it. So there's no secrecy at this point. The word's out. President Eisenhower had good reason to be frustrated with the repeated attempts at the morphing of Operation Pluto and the leaks. Eisenhower was also unsuccessful in getting anybody to support him, because nobody believes that Castro's a communist, because he's not. So nobody in Latin America wants to help. So the president goes on a state visit through South America in 1960, but the Latin heads of state were decidedly not on board, because they know if they get on board, they're next. That August, the Organization of American States also failed to pass a resolution condemning Cuba as a communist. Economic relations were the one area in which the administration could do whatever they wanted. Eisenhower continued to be pleased by the performance of Bob Anderson, who coordinated U.S. trade actions, and by mid-March, the U.S. revoked an export license already issued for the sale of helicopters to Havana. 2 months later, all existing aid programs were terminated. July, the quota for Cuban sugar was reduced to almost nothing. On his side, Castro had nationalized the entire Cuban sugar industry as a result of them tariffing it and basically dropping the amount of authorized imports. So the fact that it says that he nationalized sugar was done only after they'd already sabotaged the sugar industry by going to put additional tariffs, for lack of a better word. Political relations deteriorated. Twice during 1960, the U.S. ambassador, Philip Bonsall, Bonsal, was recalled from Havana for consultations to punish the Cubans. After Castro demanded withdrawal of half the embassy personnel in January 3rd, 1961, they ended all diplomatic relationships with Cuba. So, obviously, all brought on by the United States. None of this was done because of Castro, and it had nothing to do with communism. So, they began looking at alternatives that more closely looked like a conventional invasion, as opposed to this covert, just a whole bunch of friendly Cubans got together and decided to go take their island back. The November 29 meeting, Eisenhower questioned whether Pluto was sufficiently imaginative or bold. And wait for it, Ike repeated the concerns of William Pauley, a well-informed businessman who had complained to the president about the size of the operation, the political character. The president said he was unhappy about the general situation, referring to the transition of administrations. Ike also commented that he did not want to be in a position of turning over government in the midst of a developing emergency. And that, folks, is a bold-faced lie. The number one strategy that I have seen pattern after pattern after pattern is the CIA perfectly times the major operations to occur in the last 60 days of the last presidency, or the first 60 to 90 days of the incoming, because the incoming president doesn't want to make bold, drastic changes to an operation that's already ongoing, because they sell you on, oh my God, everybody's going to die kind of shit. And you don't want that to happen on your first 60 days in office. And then the guy that's leaving, he's like Katie bar the door, open it up, kill everybody, whatever, because I'm not going to be there to get the fallout. It is the perfect 5 to 6 month window for them to do all of their shit. And this has happened time after time after time for those exact reasons. So they are still saying no Pentagon people. And the Office of Special Operations, which is in the Pentagon, was advising on the operational plans, and they began registering objections to Pluto, um, because they saw all kinds of problems with the execution of it. For his part, Eisenhower worried that there was not enough synchronization between the different agencies that were going to be necessary. So, on December 7th, the president approved the selection of special representatives of the CIA and state to be focal points and coordinate. So, Bissell chose Tracy Barnes as his representative, and Whiting Willauer, who we've come across before. I'm not at all sure he's not CIA, just pretending to be state. Um, both of which were involved in Operation Success in maintaining the Honduran base during the Guatemalan coup. So they've got coup credits to their name. So, and my arch nemesis here comes up in this part of the story. So the leaders of the secret war gathered again on January 3rd, 1961. 17 days before JFK enters office, to discuss the diplomatic relationships and the progress of Pluto. Dick Bissell reported that the Guatemalan training camp had asked for the Cubans to be removed from his country by March 1st, and that the exiles' own morale would suffer if they didn't see action soon. Willauer agreed that there was also a time problem with the OAS, and that only suitable alternatives to Guatemala could be American bases, because nobody in Latin America wanted them doing that shit. There was, however, considerable confidence that the troops would be able to pull it off. Gordon Gray mentioned an observer's report that called the Cubans the best army in Latin America. Although he warned of some equipment shortages, General Lyman Leminsker agreed that the Cuban exiles were the best army in Latin America. This plan definitely has his stamp of approval. So, President Eisenhower administration ended with the Cuban operation in mid-course. Only 2 days before the inauguration, JFK, Eisenhower councils were still uncovering problems with Pluto. It was left for JFK to choose between alternatives that Eisenhower had summarized. But not confronting that choice himself, Eisenhower had left a question in history as to its resolve. The consequent CIA failure of the Bay of Pigs has usually been cast as the fault of Kennedy, who came in implicitly trusting the secret warriors. Eisenhower had been sitting at the apex of the secret war for now 8 years. He knew the problems of this operation. And it's almost like they were saddling JFK with bullshit. He knew the difficulties of the 5412 group as it had progressed because they had all been brought to him. The recently declassified memorandum of Operation Pluto meetings in December 1960 and early 61 revealed the arguments Kennedy was given to continue the operation were well rehearsed. Before JFK assumed office, many in high places were aware that there were significant problems with this plan. It was clear that Castro knew way more than anybody gave him credit for. The point had been raised by state on January 3rd that the American forces would have to back up the invasion because the invasion simply would not work. On the morning of the inauguration, as they left for the ceremony motorcade, Eisenhower advised JFK to do whatever he needed to do, but he needed to ensure the success of the Cuban operation. Eisenhower believed in his secret war. His administration had consistently made efforts to improve the efficiency and range of covert operations while protecting presidential control and plausible deniability. These aims were too ambitious. In the operation themselves, failure was much more prominent than successes. Control of covert operations would seem to imply the imposition of discipline, but such spending data as it was available indicate there were no major operations that had any limitations based on budget. The Operation Ajax in Iran was estimated as low as 100 to 200, but actually ended up costing $10 million. Operation Success cost twice as much as the $10 million allotted to it, meaning it cost $20 million. Before the last failure of the Cuban operation, there had already been spent 15 million as well. The estimate was 15 million. Remember, we talked about that. They were already up to $100 million for Operation Pluto, which, as we know now, was a complete failure. That's our money. This isn't even the money laundered money. This is our money. The question of direct American involvement in Operation Pluto also illustrates the control system and its dysfunction because it operates in secrecy. No Americans were to be involved in combat was one of the fundamental assumptions. After the fiasco in Indonesia, it is doubtful whether Eisenhower would have accepted any direct American involvement. But before the end of his administration, Americans were flying already, and we were going to have a Navy ship there as backup. 2 years after Kennedy's tragic death, Eisenhower would maintain in interviews and in his memoir, Waging Peace. What a fucking bastard. As he went around the world killing people, his memoirs is labeled Waging Peace. Waging covert war under the guise of peace would be a more appropriate title. That he had never approved a specific invasion plan because the exiles had never had qualified political leadership. And I just went through an entire chapter telling you he was briefed constantly and approved every piece of it. But in his book, he says that he didn't know anything about it. And his problem was they just didn't have a leader. So how can I do covert operations if we don't have a leader to install there? Because you just make that shit up as you go along. Ike's memory is convenient because approval was withheld on the invasion plan because the invasion plan that was implemented, although it was Eisenhower's plan, was not actually timed to be on Eisenhower's administration. It was timed to be at the beginning of JFK's, so Eisenhower could have that last bit of plausible deniability. So that's it for that chapter. Crazy ass shit. That's all I got to say. Crazy ass shit. All right.
I ask a question, an honest question. Do you think?
Wait a minute. Do you ask dishonest questions?
No. That is the point. Okay. Do you think Kennedy really knew the depth and the breadth of what he was, of the evil he was getting ready to step into?
Obviously, this is completely opinionated. I think he knew that there was evil. What I don't think he knew was the depth. So, and you have to, this is a very interesting question, Bridget, because Kennedy knew his dad interfered with the election to get him elected. Now, you could spend obviously hours, days, deciding whether or not the good intention was there to fix shit. There's no indication that I've seen that there was benevolence in their hearts, that they were actually trying to do, a good thing for America. They were in on the whole, Kennedy was the ambassador to the UK. He was in bed with the mafia. So, but I get the distinct impression in reading all of the stuff that I have in all of the different speeches. And I mean, obviously this is a part of every one of these Operation Gladio, because it becomes kind of the driving mantra going forward of just how big they F this up. So what I honestly think, my personal opinion, is that he was fine with the level of corruption that he thought existed. What he wasn't fine with was the level of corruption that he was exposed to once he became president. And I think that's what resulted in him hiring his brother as the attorney general and going after the mob, which his father had basically been in bed in, because he realizes the whole reason we're in Vietnam is to steal all the opium. And that the whole reason we're doing Operation, not that he knew about Gladio per se, but he did know enough about all of these other regime change in Iran and in Guatemala and all these other places to realize we're not the good guy in this. And they're basically hoodwinking him on the Bay of Pigs. And then when he gets blamed by his own Joint Chiefs of Staff when they fucked it up, and he gets blamed by the CIA when they fucked it up, he's livid. I mean, that's when you see the kind of the tiger fire come out. He's livid. He realizes they've set him up. And that's when he goes around and he starts telling people, yeah, we're not going to do this anymore. My husband just came home, so the dogs, you might hear them in the background. But anyway, yeah, he's like, we're not going to do this anymore. He agrees to go talk to Indonesia, and he's going to go visit. He's going to help Sukarno out. And he starts telling people that he's basically going to stop this shit. And that, therefore, he had to go. Miles, go ahead. Where'd Bridget go? Oh, there she is.
Hi, Colonel. I have a question for you. Are you going to be the director of GDA?
Of what?
Are you going to be the new director of GDA, the Government Disclosure Association?
Yeah, no, I'm not.
Oh, okay. I thought they were going to start that for you. So when I was living in Titusville, when I was 7 years old, and I put it down the bubble, I put it up in the nest. I did a pencil sketching of Castro. He was on Life magazine, and that was, I think it was June 2nd of 1961. And my parents were like blown away. That was like the pinnacle of my artistry. But I do have a serious question for you. And this new admin with Trump, what's going to happen with Cuba?
I don't know.
Well, look, they're our neighbors. And when this D-class starts to come out, which I believe that it will, a lot of people are going to learn some stuff they've never heard before. And I think we should normalize the situation with Cuba. It's gone on.
Well, you didn't ask me what I thought should happen. You asked me what was going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen. I think.
Okay, what do you think?
What I want to happen is I want all of the information out of the archives of the CIA exposed. I want the 20 billion pieces of paper in Suitland, Maryland, in the underground vaults, all exposed. I want it all out there. I want it to be organized in a searchable fashion where everybody can learn whatever they want to know, and that someone is tasked to create curriculum based on our real history, not our fake history, and that all of this gets exposed. And then I want us, with the deal maker for the next 4 years, to go around and normalize relationships with all of these countries that we fucked over. I'm not talking about reparations. We've all got screwed. We don't owe anybody anything. That's all bullshit. But I want normal relationships with every country in the world. And I don't really care what kind of government that country has. It's not our job to impose our standards of government on anyone else. If you want a different government, figure it out. We figured it out. You can figure it out. And like that grown-ass man in Venezuela said to me when we went to Margarita Island, at a tourist attraction, when my husband mistakenly told him, not mistakenly, but should not have told him, and he did, that I was a U.S. military retiree. And he turned around and looked at me and said, you need to come kill our president. And I just looked at him and said, "You're a grown ass man. Do it yourself." Because it's not our job to do any of that shit. And that's what I told him.
I agree 100%. And I think, look, I think we can, by giving out the truth, we can help these other countries because they've been lied to also.
Absolutely.
So if we can help them get all the truth out, but then you're right, they have to solve their own problems.
Yes.
Even like very important countries like in the Middle East. I think you know what country I'm talking about. I don't want to solve their problems over there. They have to live with their neighbors.
I want all of the foreign aid cut off. I want the USAID, the NED, all of that shit gone. We don't need to support other countries if you want to be a viable country. What the hell are you calling yourself a country for if you can't survive? And I don't mean you can't survive because we don't know, because we've been the enabler slash victimizer for the last 70 years. So you need to make it on your own. If you can't make it on your own, then sell yourself to the country that you most want to be, right? So if you take Greenland as an example, Greenland has never been a country. We all were taught it's a country. It's not a country. It's a protectorate like Puerto Rico of Denmark. So if Denmark, in theory, has granted it autonomy, but they have thus far stayed aligned with Denmark, and they take billions of dollars from them every year because they are not a profitable entity, then they can sell themselves to some other protectorate. But you can't pretend you're a country at that point. If you're going to sell yourself to something, you do become the 51st state or the 52nd state or whatever. And then it's up to us to decide whether or not we want to take on their burden. I understand the gravity of Greenland in its strategic, because if you look at, now that we know how to get through ice and, we're not going to be the Titanic anymore, you have such a direct, you don't even need the Panama Canal for the most part, because you can go right across the North Pole area, and you're in Europe and you're in Asia and you're in Russia, like in a nano nothing. And you have to go on both sides of Greenland in order to make that trek work. And so if you had security stationed in Greenland, which we do to a little bit because of the air base there, but it becomes a very strategic resource. And I'm not even talking about the minerals there. I'm just talking about the location of it. But again, the same thing with Diego Garcia, which you guys know that I've put information out about that. It is not for us to be the unwanted occupier, because that's called imperialism. It's not called national security. I'm sorry. I disagree with that. It's called imperialism when it's done by force. And we can't be doing that by force. It has to be a mutual arrangement. Tim, go ahead.
Hey, Colonel, what's your Gladio glasses tell you about the TikTok
ban? I think it's very interesting from a lot of different perspectives. So if I think they kind of work themselves into a which I'm going to enjoy watching them try to paint themselves out of, because I believe all of this is to show how no one has any principles. So TikTok ban, when Trump said it during his presidency, was a bad thing. Then when Biden did it, it was a good thing. And now Trump is saying he doesn't want it, and everybody's going, oh no, we got to have it. So I think most of the fights that Trump picks are done to illustrate the fact that these people have no principles of which they operate from. It is all anti whatever Trump, and obviously he is just the latest in the picture, but again, they don't have any principle as it relates to any of this stuff. So if you guys do a deep dive on TikTok, it's actually very interesting. So the CIA, because they don't control it and they don't own it, has had difficulty calling information out of it. Like there's no back door. So not having a back door for them is obviously their default is get rid of it. And so I think Trump played them. So I think they came to Trump and said, you have to get rid of it. And Trump says, okay, but I know if I say I'm going to get rid of it, they're going to want to keep it. So kind of like the double negative. So he says he wants to get rid of it, which means the media is all going to pile on saying we can't get rid of it. That's, you're banning free speech, you're a fascist, blah, blah, blah. So I think the entire thing is playing the whiplash, because the only way you wake people up is for them to watch that. Psychologically, I read this paper and most of that shit goes right over my head. It makes me feel like I'm questioning my own sanity. But the psychobabble says that if people are like in a cult, the way that you deprogram them is, well, there's a couple of different ways, but the one that's being illustrated right now is the jolting out. So you present them with undeniable, like 180-degree information the other way, and you do it suddenly. And then once you get them kind of looking in that direction, you whip them back, and then you whip them back. And by that, it's like kind of shaking an adult, like, wake the fuck up. Watching that play out is what I think we're watching right now. And I think TikTok is being that. TikTok is an entity that the CIA doesn't control. So the bottom line is they want it gone. And they're going to do whatever they can to get it gone. That's their whole problem with X and why they mounted a boycotting of X among. And again, go back and look at all those companies that agreed with the boycotting of X. Every one of them are associated with the CIA. Every one of them has had CIA embeds in them. They are under the control of the CIA. So that's what the ban on, or the boycott on X was about. And I think that's exactly what's happening with TikTok. They can't control it. They don't mine data out of it, and they don't want it here, which then forces everybody onto the platforms that they've compromised, with the exception of X or True Social. And you can bet that they're involved in anything that pops up, especially anything that is embraced by the Democrats. Does that help?
Yeah, but what's killing me is the hypocrisy.
They're full of that.
They're saying they're stealing data and they're spying on Americans and they're giving misinformation, and that's exactly what
they did,
and all them other guys.
Yes, but I think that's what has to be pointed out. That's exactly, you are complaining that they're doing exactly what you did.
Bingo.
Yeah, exactly. Cousin it. Yeah, exactly. Cousin it.
Yeah, the other thing with this whole TikTok ban, if you recall, was right back when the genocide in Gaza started to get noticing. And because the CIA can't control TikTok and the narrative, the younger generation is calling out all of these wars and all of these deaths. And they can't have that because obviously they're getting caught with their pants down. Which is why now all of a sudden it's a bipartisan bill, because if you look at who actually is funding these guys in Washington, D.C., why that would be AIPAC. So they're going to do exactly what AIPAC tells them to do. And right from the beginning of this whole we're going to be on TikTok thing, AIPAC was the one screaming and yelling the loudest about the fact that they can't shut it down.
So this is their way of shutting it down and hiding their dirty wars. And the irony is that all these kids are actually going over to Red Note, they call it, but it's actually like Mao's Red Book, that is in fact run by the communist Chinese government. And they are, I don't know how many videos people have seen, but they're actually having a lot of fun. So we'll see how long that one lasts, because so far nobody's said boo about that in Washington, D.C., which is actually quite telling. So anyway, that's just my 2 cents.
Bridget?
I have a question from the audience. What vaults in Maryland and where?
Suitland Parkway, in just outside of Washington, D.C., just north of Andrews Air Force Base, is an underground facility that's like 7 football fields big and like multiple stories down underground, not just a single story, like a couple of stories, as I understand it. I know exactly where it's at. I used to have to drive by it when I was stationed at Andrews. And it is an underground vault where all of the classified old files are stored as part of the archives. So they're just in boxes and boxes and boxes. I've seen pictures of the inside of it. It's crazy. Miles, go ahead.
Is that where the Ark is?
No. Miles, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to go
Sorry,
back.
I couldn't help it.
I want to go back on topic. So I just see, because I know how Trump thinks, I think I do anyway. If you look at Cuba and the geography of it and the location, I mean, it's real estate, right? It's location, location, location. That island could be one of the richest islands in the Caribbean. And it's so close to Miami and Mar-a-Lago. And it just seems like that would be the perfect situation to have a resort there. I mean, all those people on the island could be super rich.
They were super rich. Well, except for the ones that were enslaved.
I mean, everything could change for them. And I don't know, like you said, you don't know how it's going to play out. But I see Trump making moves in other parts of the world. And I think that I'm looking at what Don Jr.'s doing and the companies that he's going to be working with. I just see it's a no-brainer.
So let me ask you, I agree with you, by the way, but Cousin It, what is the reason they're telling us that we have to ban TikTok?
You're talking about in relation to Israel?
No. What is the reason
because they can't hide their dirty wars anymore.
No. What is the actual reason that they use? They didn't say that in Congress. What did they say was the reason they're banning TikTok?
Trying to steal our info.
National security.
Stealing our
National security.
Right.
Who has the national security rubber stamp?
Oh, would that be the CIA for $1,000, Alex?
Yes, you won $1,000. So we are being told that our national security.
Still waiting for my booze.
Yeah, I know. We're being told, you're the one that wanted to play Jeopardy. I don't. So we're being told our national security is going to be jeopardized if we don't close TikTok today. Well, the only people that have a national security rubber stamp is the CIA. So the CIA has whispered in all of those people's ears, produced documents, and we just went through an entire fucking chapter of how they produce documents that lie out their ass that says whatever they want them to say in order to be able to get a communist label on someone. So those same people are telling you that your national security is at risk if we do not immediately ban TikTok. So first, to me, the very first thing is who said they were a national security risk? And I want to see what makes them a national security risk, because I don't believe the rubber stamp national security bullshit the CIA produces. So that's the first thing to me. If the CIA says it jeopardizes our national security, I know unequivocally it does not, because they say the opposite about everything. Apollonia, go ahead.
Thank you. It was Biden saying that it was national security, and Trump actually is the one that does not want it to be banned, because he actually did a video advocating for the app and saying that he got a lot of support and vote from the young kids.
But Apollonia,
because of the app.
Apollonia, this, I'm telling you, during Trump's first administration, he was all for banning the app. Go back and look. I believe that was a ploy of his, because the CIA came and told him the exact same thing they came and told Biden, that it was going to jeopardize our national security. And Trump, knowing the CIA lies to him about everything, said, okay, let's ban it. Well, then as soon as he said, let's ban it, everybody was going, oh my God, you can't ban it. It's free speech. He knew that was going to happen. So everybody in the country is telling everybody else why you can't ban TikTok. So now you fast forward to today and he's telling you, no, I'm not going to ban TikTok. I mean, all of these people love me on TikTok. Why would I ban TikTok? I think he's playing them. But the same CIA that told Biden it was going to jeopardize our national security told Trump the exact same thing. They don't want TikTok because they don't have a back door to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I wanted to ask you, because honestly, we're finding out that Trump, I mean, I don't even know if he has been on this for years and it was time for him to come in and clean house. But at what point you think, before going into the first term, knew exactly how bad it was, or did he sort of find out in the middle of it? Because that's always at the back of my mind.
Yeah.
And one more thing, and then I'll stop, shut my mouth. They also said that Cuba is not a terrorist thing, or like a group anymore. That just came, I think, yesterday or the day before. What does that mean, removing that label from Cuba?
Well, it's huge, because they amended the document 5412-2 that if you are labeled communist or a terrorist, you can be assassinated as a head of state. The anything is available as far as covert actions, no holds barred. They can do anything, absolutely anything, if you carry those two designations. So if they are saying it's not a terrorist organization, that removes that authority for the CIA to act in that manner. So that's a huge thing. But yes, I do believe that a long time ago, Trump was approached as the possible person to be able to come in and do what's being done. Again, I just think that it's not, it's there was too many opportunities for Trump to stumble and have some little thing that could have been used against him as a New York builder, a guy in the casino business, that if it wasn't either put in his mind or in the back of his mind himself, this possibility, there may have been a few missteps, even for someone who has integrity dealing in those environments. The fact that there's nothing there, nothing, in all of the years of being in compromising situations, he acquitted himself with an impeccable record. That in that environment is like out on the scale of nearly impossible for you to do. And I'm not talking about just being, a loudmouth kind of flagrant pain in people's butt. I'm talking about criminality. And the fact that he was always on this side of that line in an environment where everybody has been on the other side of that line at least once in all of the lines of business, and he's in all of them and he never stepped across that line, tells me that this has been an operation that has occurred over much longer than the last 10 years. Miles?
Yeah, you stole the words right out of my mouth. Now that we're doing research on what we think was a planned operation a long time ago, even going back and looking at The Apprentice with Gladio glasses on, oh, wait a minute. What are they doing there? And even going back to, even though it was a terrible show called The Trump Card, there were certain things that I don't know when this started, but I think a lot of people knew, going all the way back to when they killed JFK, that something was in the works, and if they didn't do something, we couldn't recover from it. Let's put it that way. So, like I said, I don't know when it started, but hopefully we'll find out. I mean, it'll make the best book, probably a series of books ever, if it comes out, because it's a very sophisticated operation.
I agree. I agree. Apollonia?
Real quick, there's a series they did about Trump, and one of the clips, and I'm gonna go back and see it. One of the family, Gambino family, one of the big families in New York, an older guy was saying, you just couldn't get to Trump. No, you just couldn't. And we had that talk about going and speaking to him, and my answer was to them, what are you gonna do? He's surrounded by retired CIA. As soon as you go, you're going to get, what are you gonna do? In jail. So, and these are people that were there at that time, in that moment. So that's, I
think we lost her. Did we lose her? Bridget, can you?
I could hear her. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. She just, the very tail end of her got cut off.
Oh, okay.
That should be enough.
Oh, there you go.
Oh, you hear me now?
Yeah, I do.
So I'm sorry. So this guy stated that, and this is a documentary about Trump, that he was always surrounded by retired CIA, and there was a lot of people, have their doubts about where we're going as a nation, and is this another psyop? And I mean, I can see that, but in my heart, I believe that we're in the right path, and a lot of stuff is going to clean up. What do you think about that?
Well, somebody would have to share with me. My dog decided he wants to be on camera here and look out the window. You would have to share with me who was the retired CIA people that surrounded him. I'm going to withhold judgment on that comment until I know who those were. Tim, go ahead.
So Kash Patel gets confirmed and opens Pandora's box and outs everything specifically about CIA. What do you think the CIA's response is going to be?
Well, I think the CIA has to be disbanded. They don't do intel. They've never done intel for the American people. They do intel for oligarchs, and they do paramilitary activity for oligarchs so they don't have to get their hands dirty. There's no reason why we have a CIA at all. None. And you're never going to convince me of anything else. There are intelligence functions that are necessary, and they are performed by places like NSA and DIA. I'm not saying we don't need intel. I am saying you don't need a centralized intelligence agency that doesn't do intelligence for the American people or to our benefit. They have overwhelmingly and completely done intelligence. So you guys know through all of these stories, what do they have in common? They have CIA people embedded in businesses going and getting intelligence on businesses. They're not getting, the only intelligence from a government that they ever get is whether or not the government's going to shut down the businesses. They're not getting, and let's just assume 9/11 actually happened and it was actually radical Islamists that did it. I don't believe that for a minute, but let's just assume that. You have CIA assets in every fucking country in the Middle East, every country. And I mean hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of them. And you're telling me, after spending billions and billions of dollars on quote unquote intelligence, they can't find them? They didn't know anything about the chatter of it happening and were just blindsided by that? Well, if intelligence for the American people and saving our lives was your number one job, you fucking suck at it. Because this has happened repeatedly. And with well-known, supposedly, networks of terrorists or communists. And so you would be hard-pressed, if you actually knew history, to sit down and honestly say that they collect intel for what's best for America. They do not. They never have. They collect intel for oligarchs for them to do business. Now, they'll come back and tell the oligarch, hey, we found out that Castro is going to repatriate this airline that William Pauly, our buddy that's a millionaire that helps us on all these coups, they're going to repatriate his sugar plantations and they're going to repatriate his airline and all of his bus terminals in Cuba. So we've got to coup him. They will bring intel back from Chile that says ITT is going to get stolen from the American oligarch and the mining concession is going to get renegotiated. So we got to fly some assassins in and get rid of that guy. They're able to thwart all of that. What they can't thwart is anything that kills us and doesn't do us any good. Or they can't thwart anything that would protect us. So they are not in the intelligence business for the American people. They're in the intelligence business for oligarchs and their wealth protection. Bridget, go ahead.
Came up in today's show with Paul Williams when he was talking about how they did a literal strip search on him when he accidentally had some prescription medication in his pocket when
he didn't even have the medication in his pocket. He had ran an iron over it that left residue in his pocket.
Right. And he says if they can detect this and they can't stop all this drugs coming in, it's not adding up. And that's where, a lot of the times when we pursue down on these trails, it's logic that ends up leading us to these trails. It's just simple logic. If they can, perfect example, if they can detect that residue, you're telling me they're just now finding a few tunnels down at our southern border that they didn't know existed? I call bullshit.
Well, they have the technology to find the 100-foot down lake under Greenland, but they can't find the tunnel.
Right, exactly.
And they have they have the technology. And oh, by the way, that Battelle company is one of the ones that creates all this technology. And who do they have working for them? The CIA.
It's purely pointless. I'm sure.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. All right. I'm going to go ahead and go so that we're not late for our dinner. Thank you guys for joining me early today so that we could get this done. And I will be back on Monday at our normal time and back home out of my mobile command post. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. And thanks for tuning in and watching that interview with Paul Williams. I'm still on a high. That's going to take me about 24 hours. Because what's...
Did you get a scheduled next date?
Not yet. He was going to get back to me. What I find amazing about talking to him is he says things that like tomorrow will just hit something new for me. And just like the whole, I was running through his background for like the entire week in between the two shows. And I was overwhelmed by the fact that he had been, even more so than ever I was, operating as an FBI informant and being on all of those television shows. I mean, he was caught up in the celebrity, um, uh, you know, the researcher celebrityness of doing what he felt he was, put on this earth to do. Research, history, that's his passion. And he thought he knew what he was talking about. And he wrote books. They're in writing. They will never not be in writing. Only to find out. And again, I can't imagine that, because you wrote entire volumes of work that now, knowing what you know now, is basically a lie, and people believed your work. um and then to know, the corruption in the FBI, and you can say that you were part of an effort to bring down a few mafia people, which was probably just a competitor to somebody else, and they just wanted him out of the way, and they're going to use you to help. And i just I was overwhelmed every time I started thinking about that guy. And by him telling the truth, having the fortitude and the commitment to truth, to stand up and say what he said today, everything I thought I know was a lie. All of the books that I wrote was based on a false premise that we were the good guys. And when I discovered Operation Gladio, my entire life changed, and it did. His phone never rang. They were in the middle of sourcing a movie for Operation Gladio that got dropped, but they basically had bought the rights to it. So, it just is, it's overwhelming. Um, and I just, my heart was like, holy crap. Um, because the, and I'm not, that's like a break. Um, because one of the conversations I had with a dear friend of mine when I first discovered Operation Gladio was, um, the because I was cautioned not to talk about it. When I told him the depth of what was going on, he said, if anybody ever notices you, and thank God they haven't yet, um, that they'll come at you with everything, because that's who these people are. And it it didn't deter me. I mean, it's like, whatever. But I could, in some small little way, understand what happened with him, just because you really are. I mean, there any day I could be recalled to active duty and have some false charges like they just did with January 6th, and my retirement would be taken from me. Um, because that's the power that they have, and that's the reason why they're able to do what they do, because they have that power over you. But there has to be some people that says it really doesn't matter. And it really doesn't matter. The truth is worth whatever effort it takes to get the truth out there. And that's what we're going to do, even if it's this little slice. Every time you guys repost our information, every time you guys do the at Colonel Towner on X or whatever, one more eye is going to see it. And slowly but surely, everybody is going to understand this, and it's going to come out. And you guys are going to be the Advon team of assisting people in your local areas with the truth. And I know you guys are doing that already. So with your family, your friends, on social media, you guys are going and taking the stuff and posting it on Facebook. I've had people DM me about that. So it'll all get out there. We're all going to know, and you guys are going to be the first in the line of many. So, Miles, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to wish everybody have a happy weekend. Have a great time. It's so boring. You think, well, nothing's going to happen. You might just wake up on Tuesday. So It's gonna be really boring.
Yeah. I'm going to let Apollonia and Tim, but you guys need to keep it short. I really do need to run. Go ahead, Apollonia.
Real quick, I think I have ADD, but I'm able to catch your conversation. It's taught me a lot, but I really still waiting for big accounts to invite you as a spokesperson, because they have everybody. They have dog catcher spokesperson or a host for the day, but they don't have you, and that bothers me, because that would reach so many people. And I don't know, it's by accident or just by fear, acknowledging that we've been lied to, because it took me a minute too. So I'm not going to say it's nefarious that you have not been on the biggest platforms that X has to, and the biggest names. So yeah, that's I just wanted to say that I wish you would this year, if I had a wish, that would be one.
Well, thank you. I do believe, and it has been pointed out to me with specifics, that most of the big accounts are compromised. They are there for a reason, and it's not the truth. That's not all of them. Many of them. And I have had people share with me exactly who some of them are. You guys all know the people. But it'll happen. It'll happen in God's time. I'm absolutely convinced of that. Tim, go ahead.
Y'all wish me luck. I'm going into the swamp tomorrow. I've got tickets to the inauguration.
Well, good luck, Tim. If you run across Brian Cates, tell him I said hi. He got there today. All right, guys. God bless. Have a nice weekend. And we will have inauguration information to talk about on Monday. So thanks for being here. Take care. All right, guys. Thanks for being here on Rumble for the second time today. I appreciate it. And have a nice weekend. Say hello to Maverick. You're on camera, buddy. You're on camera. His dad came home, so he wants to go for a walk. So I'll get off here. You guys take care. Have a nice weekend. I'll see you on Monday. Well, it didn't close. It still says I'm live. Come up, says delete room.